Welcome to The Explainer. We all live inside our own minds, right? But have you ever stopped to think about where that mind actually is? For most of human history, nobody really knew. So today, we're going to dive into that incredible quest to locate the mind. It's a wild journey, let me tell you, that goes from ancient arguments about the heart all the way to some pretty shocking brain surgeries and lands us right where we are today, looking at the brain's complex networks. So, what's the field that tackles this huge question? Well, it's called neuropsychology. And really, it's all about connecting the physical stuff in our heads, the actual brain, to the abstract world of the mind. We're talking about our thoughts, our feelings, our actions. It's basically the ultimate bridge between the biological and the psychological. All right, so here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the early debate. Was it the heart or the brain? Then we'll get into the whole mind-body puzzle. After that, we'll trace the race to actually locate our thoughts, which led to mapping the brain. Then things get a little intense with some controversial brain surgeries. And finally, we'll land on how we see the brain today as one giant interconnected network. Okay, let's dive right in. Our story starts with a question that feels, well, kind of obvious to us now. But for the ancients, it was a huge debate. Where does you actually live? Yeah, for centuries, the answer was totally up for grabs. Was it the beating, warm heart in your chest? Or was it that quiet, kind of mysterious lump of tissue in your skull? Two big ideas popped up. So on one side, you had what's called the cardiac hypothesis. Aristotle was the big name behind this one. He figured, hey, the heart is warm, it's active, it's got to be the source of life and feeling. And the brain, get this, he thought it was just a radiator, basically an air conditioner for the blood. Seriously. But then you had the other camp, the brain hypothesis. Guys like Hippocrates and Galen were pushing this. They were convinced the brain was the control center for thought and behavior. Galen even got specific, pointing to the fluid-filled spaces in the brain, the ventricles, and saying that's where the magic happens.
But here's where it gets really interesting. There's some wild archaeological evidence that suggests people knew the brain was important way back when. Archaeologists have found ancient skulls with holes drilled right into them, a procedure we now call trephination. And the crazy part, a lot of these skulls show signs of healing. That means the person survived the surgery. It tells us our ancestors were actually performing brain surgery, maybe to relieve pressure or, let out evil spirits. It's this powerful ancient intuition that whatever was going on with us, it started in the head. So as the brain hypothesis started to win out, the debate didn't just end. Nope, it morphed into something even trickier, the famous mind-body problem. And the guy who really put this puzzle into words was the philosopher René Descartes. He came up with this idea called dualism. Basically, he said the mind, the non-physical thinking you, and the body, the physical machine you live in, are two completely different things. Which of course leads to a giant blinking question: how in the world does the non-physical mind tell the physical body what to do? Descartes' answer to that question was, well, it was really creative and very mechanical for its time. He pinpointed a tiny spot in the center of the brain, the pineal gland, as the big meeting point. The idea was that the mind would literally tilt this gland, which would then direct these gas-like things he called animal spirits through the nerves to make your muscles move. I know, it sounds pretty out there to us now, but you have to remember, he was trying to explain it using the cutting-edge tech of his day, which was hydraulics. It was a really revolutionary attempt to connect the two worlds. All right, so that mechanical view really kicked things into gear for the 19th century. The race was officially on. The question wasn't if the brain controlled behavior anymore. Now it was how, and crucially, where. And wow, the discoveries started coming fast and furious in this period. First, they nailed down some of the basics, like figuring out which part of the brain stem keeps us breathing. Then came the huge discovery that the nerves for feeling things and the nerves for moving things were totally separate wires. But the real game changers were about language. First, Paul Broca found a specific spot in the left frontal lobe that lets us produce speech. And not long after, Carl Wernicke found another area that's all about understanding speech. Two different spots for two parts of the same process. Incredible. So this was a massive shift in how people thought about the brain. I mean, it wasn't just one big blob of tissue working together anymore. This was the dawn of cortical localization, the idea that specific brain areas do specific jobs. You can think of it like a factory, with different departments each handling their own unique task. Okay, so once everyone was on board with this localization idea, the next step was pretty obvious, but also super ambitious. Let's map the whole thing. Let's create a complete blueprint of the brain. And the most famous map came from a German neurologist named Corbinian Brodmann back in 1909. He painstakingly looked at the brain's cortex under a microscope, cell by cell, and divided it into 52 different zones based on their structure. We've got a couple of examples here, Area 4 for motor control, Area 17 for vision. And what's just wild is that this map, which is over 100 years old, is still used by neuroscientists today. It's that foundational. But, of course, the story wasn't quite that simple. It never is, right? On the one hand, you had a surgeon named Walter Penfield who seemed to prove the mapping idea perfectly. During surgery on awake patients, he'd gently stimulate a spot on the brain and zap, their thumb would twitch. Every time. It was incredibly precise. But on the other hand, a researcher named Carl Lashley was finding something totally different. He worked with rats in memory, and he found that when it came to complex stuff like that, it didn't really matter where the brain damage was. What mattered was how much of the brain was damaged. A real puzzle. So this new, powerful, and maybe a little confusing understanding of the brain's map led to a brand new field, one that was dramatic and, as we'll see, deeply controversial: functional neurosurgery.
The idea behind it was, well, it was radical. The thinking went like this. If a behavior is tied to a brain area, maybe you can fix the behavior by operating on that area. And the first person to actually try this on psychiatric patients back in the late 1800s was a Swiss physician named Gottlieb Burckhardt. And this line of thinking led to one of the most infamous procedures in medical history, the prefrontal lobotomy. Just look at that number, over 3,500. That's how many were performed by just one man, an American doctor named Walter Freeman. He popularized a technique that was horrifically simple. He used a tool that was basically an ice pick, inserted it through the patient's eye socket to get to the brain, and severed the connections in the frontal lobes. The whole thing could be over in minutes. And the rise and fall of the lobotomy is just shocking. It happened so fast. Believe it or not, the guy who invented it, Egis Moniz, won the Nobel Prize for it in 1949. That's how legitimate it became. But just as quickly, it all came crashing down. The side effects were just too awful to ignore. People were left with totally flat, changed personalities. Then, in the 50s, the first antipsychotic drugs came along, offering a much safer alternative. And thankfully, the lobotomy was pretty much abandoned. So the end of the lobotomy era happened to coincide with a massive technological revolution, one that would completely change how we see the brain and bring us right into the modern age of neuropsychology. You see, for the first time in human history, we developed technology that let us look inside a living, thinking brain without cutting it open. I'm talking about things like PET scans and especially fMRI. Suddenly, we could literally watch the brain in action. We could see which parts lit up when someone talked, or solved a puzzle, or even felt an emotion. It was a total game changer. And this led to a massive paradigm shift. We moved away from that simple localization idea. You know, the brain has a switchboard where each switch does one thing, and we moved towards a new idea called connectionism. The way we see the brain now is that it's much more like the internet. It's a dynamic, super connected network. And complex functions, things like consciousness or memory, they don't just live in one little box. They emerge from the constant chatter and collaboration between many, many different brain regions all working together. So, that brings our journey to an end. From the heart versus the brain, all the way to the brain as a network. But it also leaves us with a really big question to chew on. If you aren't located in one specific spot, but are instead a dynamic pattern of connections firing across a network, what does that say about who we are? What does that change about our very sense of self?